Good evening, Lake Orion. This is Anthony Taramina. Welcome to History Now here on ONTV. I'm here today with one of the greatest minds in Lake Orion history, Mr. Donn Hoganson.
Geez, thank you, Anthony. That's
Your former
quite a compliment.
You're former Lake Orion announcer. You're a former coach. You're also a former teacher. You are also an author. You wrote a book called The History of Lake Orion Football from 1968 to 2000.
Yeah, the book's available at Donn.Hoganson at gmail.com. And it's about a 50-page edition. It has a lot of memorabilia. In fact, if there are any players watching here, your picture's liable to be included in the book, former players, up till 2000. And it's $20.
That's awesome. I encourage you guys. To come out and get the book. It is a great read. I want to talk about the book, but I'm also going to want to talk about the seasons of Lake Orion football. Particularly, You wanted to start off with talking about the 1968 football season. At that time, Lake Orion was in the Oakland A.
That's right.
The coach was Doug Holcomb. Now, you were coaching at this time.
Yes. Actually, we were brought in, not simultaneous, but at the same time. Doug was the backup quarterback to Bob Greasy at Purdue.
Oh, wow.
And his father was a football coach at Purdue and Northwestern and was involved with the Chicago White Sox as a general manager and Chicago Mustangs soccer team years and years ago. And that, of course, faded because soccer has now become the big movement nowadays. Even the men and women, they're on national TV or whatever, which was unusual back then. But anyhow, the previous regime was having trouble winning games. And an Oakland University professor named Dick Brace lived over in Indianwood Manor right across from the country club with the gatehouse and the big house in between in the servants' quarters.
Yep.
And he contacted Jim Hogue and Lou Monday, the superintendent, and Joe Duras and the principal and Hal Carlin, and told them about this kid that his wife, his daughter Pam, was married to, and that she was pregnant, and he was a student assistant on the football team at UCLA, and usually you just get graduate credits and maybe a small token for being a graduate assistant coach. Right. So anyhow, long story short, they brought in Doug, and within a year, I'd say, he established, I think, the passing game in high school football in Oakland County. It was sort of a Woody Hayes power football situation, you know, a cloud of dust and 3 yards and whatever. And Holcomb, I give him credit for opening up the game, and he was quite a wizard. Every week, he had 3 or 4 plays on each side of the ball, but he loved to throw the ball. And each week he would come and he would run the same plays, but it would be from an I formation, a triple stack I, a power I, a pro set, and whatever. So people that were filming the games, they would say, hey, wait a minute, this wasn't on the film or this wasn't on the scouting report. But it was basically the same plays coming from Holcomb, just from a different formation. Then I was brought in 1968. Doug's first assistant was George Elias. And George Elias was...
That name rings a bell in basketball.
Basketball, right.
Yes.
He was a big-time basketball coach as far as Lake Orion went, and sent many kids. Gary Mize was a 6'8" kid. That played basketball for him. Paul Bailey downtown, the attorney, and many of the other kids that young men that have stuck around Lake Orion for their adult life and whatever, played basketball for George. He had a lot of big kids, and basketball, of course, had the districts and whatever. And
Yep.
this was before the Dan Fife era, really. Okay. Dan's been around for a long time and probably the greatest boys basketball coach in the state of Michigan, if not the Midwest. But anyhow, George Elias was his first assistant, and George only lasted 1 year. And then the other coaches came to fruit. Myself, I started out as a JV coach with a fellow by the name of Chad Dutcher, who left Lake Orion and went to become the head coach at Gaylord High School.
Oh, wow.
And established their program. He was a former Marine, tough guy, okay? Joe Gonzalez was the freshman coach. He ended up being superintendent of schools, I believe, for Bay City schools and whatever. So he moved on well from Lake Orion. And then Nick Nera, does that name ring a bell?
Yes, that does.
Jim Knapp and Nick Nera were track stars, and Nick was the quarterback for the football team. Okay, and his favorite receiver was Jim, and anyhow, he was the assistant for a couple of years along with myself. And then, I don't know if you've ever heard of the name Chester Markle, but he was a field goal.
Rings the bell.
Yeah, field goal kicker for the Green Bay Packers.
Yeah.
Okay? He was from Imlay City, Michigan.
Wow.
And there was a high school All-American from Three Rivers, Michigan. His name was Doug Baker. And that name should ring a little bell with you, because he ended up being the art teacher and the line coach and interior line. Was really an excellent snapper, long snap, short snap coach. And he, believe it or not, used to snap at Hillsdale College. They played under Muddy Waters for Chester Markle, who went on to Green Bay.
Nice.
And Baker came to Lake Orion. And then so there was Holcomb, Baker, and myself, and then Nick for 2 or 3 years. And then Doug was really a good quarterback, okay? He could throw the ball a length of the field and pinpoint it. And so the guy that coaches from Harrison now, his name escapes me.
Harrington?
Harrington, yes, yeah.
Harrington.
He was the quarterback for the Pontiac Firebirds for the Midwestern Football League, and he got hurt.
Wow.
So I forget the Tom. I forget the coach's name, but anyhow, he was a former Detroit whatever. He was a former player and coach for the Detroit Lions, and in retirement was coaching in the Midwest Football League.
Nice.
For the Pontiac Arrows. So Holcomb became the quarterback for the Pontiac Arrows, and of course the ball players loved it because they'd have practice all week and have a game, and then Saturday night they'd be down at Wisner Stadium watching Doug play football. Well, one of the other teams that they played was the Flint Sabres, and Marty Malatin, who you should know, was a running back for them, okay? And that's how Doug and Marty got hooked up. So it ended up being Doug, Marty, myself as defensive coordinator, and Doug Baker, okay? And the winning, the hitting, and whatever you want to call it. The tradition started, believe it or not, prior to the Kirk Gibson era at Waterford Kettering.
Wow.
We were there. The coach, I believe, was Jim Larkin, a famous coach at that time. And Holcomb loved to throw the ball. He loved to have 3 receivers in a pattern. And so about a quarter of the way through the second quarter, he called I formation 88 flood, okay? And Garrell Roberts, I'm sure you know through Steve Roberts, had the long square out pattern. Rick Tolles, the tight end, had the short square out pattern, and Chuck Whipple had the short square out pattern, okay?
Nice.
All right, so Bill Baker and Mike Baker was his brother, was the guard. Got the ball, rolled out to the right. Chuck was wide open, flipping the pass. Rick Tolles, Garrell, and all that did their downfield blocking, and Chuck went in and scored a touchdown, and that started it all. And from then on, it seemed like it was 7-2, 8-1 all the way.
Wow.
Yeah.
One thing I want to bring up is in the Oakland A, Lake Orion had rivalries with a lot of schools that they didn't, that back in the older days, back in your days, that Lake Orion would play Avondale and Clawson and Madison and Troy and Fitzgerald and Rochester.
Right.
What was those games like? Those rivalries.
Well, of course, in the early days, there wasn't any such thing as playoffs, districts, regionals, quarterfinals, whatever. So when the ninth game came, the season was over. And Holcomb began to establish himself in Oakland County as a coach of notoriety. And there were some hard-hitting games. My wife used to come to the games, and she'd say you could sit up in the stands and hear the cracking from the pads up in the stands. Holcomb and myself were good teachers, good people, funny people, people that had me in class, said they enjoyed the class or whatever because I made it fun or whatever it was, whether it was poetry, English, or writing, or whatever. But some of them couldn't get used to the fact that, for example, myself, I'd be so goofy in the classroom, but the minute you step the line on the football field, you take on a different personality. And Doug was the dual personality guy, okay? He spent hours after hours in the 6th hour. It used to be what they called the teams. All had 6-hour phys ed, so they could watch films or practice free throws during basketball season or get ready for track during 6th hour. And he'd be watching films and with the teams, and we had a 16mm Kodak projector that when you press the button, it would go backwards, and then you could watch. So the kids would get tired of it because he'd be going back and forth and back. Here's why you missed your block and whatever. I think the best way to describe what the games were like was there was so much intensity, and the kids were so fired up that Steve Allison, in one big game that we were playing at home.
That name rings a bell, the Allison
Yeah, well,
name.
from Roger Allison.
Yeah.
That's his, he's Steve, Roger's older brother. He had a slightly torn Achilles, and he wanted to play so bad he took a cortisone shot or whatever, so he wouldn't feel it. And his dad said when that wore off, it was a mind blower. And one year we were playing Madison, Lamphere for a league championship, because again there weren't any playoffs. And I believe it was Terry McCoffin that played with a broken wrist, played both ways with a broken wrist, but soft casted and then taped heavily. And Chuck Stevens, who just passed away, he was in the Orion paper not too long ago, his obit, and he was on the computer. And if you remember, if you're from Lake Orion and you remember, and then they did Chuck Stevens and whatever. And he played with a broken ankle, which was soft casted and taped and whatever. And that's how intense it was. Today, that would be out of the question.
Right.
Okay. There was a little bit more strong verbiage, I guess you want to say. I remember there was a quarterback who has still passed away, or not still passed away, but recently passed away, by the name of Ed Cabillas. And Doug used to grab him by the face mask and pull him and whatever if he missed the receiver or whatever, you know, and he'd go nose to nose with him. And Ed would be so intense and so in fear that his eyes would cross, okay? Because he didn't want to let down the coach, you know. And if you talk to those guys out of the 60s and 70s, you know, you hear a lot about, if you remember the 60s, you weren't there. Well, there's no hope without dope was the thing, okay? Acid, quaaludes, whatever. And there was our share of it in Lake Orion. But guys like Jimmy Vaccaro, Jeff Naylor, Chuck Whipple, and all, those guys played it straight, okay? And they were tough football players, really tough. I can remember following Jimmy at a Central in Western Michigan. Jimmy ended up being the all-time rushing leader for Western Michigan University when he played under Mike Berry. And I can remember going up to talk to him after a game as he came out of the locker room, and there'd be no skin on his knuckles or whatever, you know, from getting hit by people's helmets and whatever. So those eras seem to be not so much a finesse, not that Chris Bell is a finesse coach or whatever, but, you know, no huddle was out of the question. And I think Chris throws the ball as much as he runs it, but Holcomb established the hitting and the Orion Tough situation, logo, so that when teams played us, they knew they were ready. I remember we beat Rochester Adams when Coach Haas was the coach there. They didn't have their own field at the time we played at Rochester, and we beat them 64-0. And Coach Haas came across and said, "Good job, Doug." He said, "I've been telling these guys they're sissies all along, and they don't believe me." He says, "Maybe I can get through to them now." So those are really exciting, exciting days. And of course, you mentioned 1979 when the millage failed and the season was canceled. Okay.
I want to get back on that because we got to take a break.
Okay.
Yep, we're going to take a break.
All right.
We'll be right back to History Now here on ON TV. Hello, Lake Orion and Oakland County. This is Sammy Termina here, talking a new show here called OA Now. We're going to talk about sports from football to basketball to volleyball to track and field to soccer, cross country, etc. here on OA Now on ON TV. Welcome back to History Now here on ON TV. I'm here with my guest, Mr. Donn Hoganson. Hoagie, you doing all right?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. You want to talk about Orion football? You want to talk about Orion basketball, baseball, or whatever? Let's go back for just a few seconds, okay? I wanted to tell you that when I came here in 1968, there was a fence and at the back of the stands, and there was a press box built by Nick Nera and Don Griffith, who recently passed away. That was kind of like a manufactured home, okay? Everything was homemade, so to speak, all right? But the key, some of the things that might blow your mind is that there was a football field and there was a track, and believe it or not, they played night baseball.
Wow.
And they should be doing it now. They have such a good ball, but they should put some lights on the baseball team field because they have such a good team. But anyhow, the baseball field was where the soccer field is now, and home plate was in the far corner.
Oh, wow.
So sometimes they would have to radio back and forth if there was a track meet going on, and the team was batting and whatever, because they'd hit the ball, and if they hit like a home run out of the park, the ball would roll over and get on the track. Well, you didn't want your sprinter stepping on that and breaking his ankle. And when I coached my first baseball game for Lake Orion, I coached on that baseball field. But that's how different things were. Then in the later part of Hal Carlin's reign as athletic director, they moved the baseball field back of the old high school, which was E-shaped. And then they got a bond issue passed, and they closed it all up. And they played baseball back there, and then with the big $58 million high school thing, they moved it to where it is now. But I thought that was an interesting point that you might not have known, and that you'd be.
I did not.
Yeah, it was really cool. What used to happen is there was a guy by the name of, I think his name was Larry Abbey. He was on the school board, and he worked for the telephone company. And what they would do is they'd bring in one of those trucks, and they'd loosen the football lights, and they'd turn them around for the baseball games, for night baseball games. There's probably, if your crowd is a younger crowd, or the last 20 years that watches your program, they probably wouldn't even know that. But they used to play football and baseball down at the old Elizabeth Street School.
Awesome.
Or the Fred Eamon Continual Adult Learning Center, or the Fecal Center.
Yep.
Yeah, okay.
One thing I want to talk about, we'll talk about the rivalries on the next show.
Okay.
I want to talk about the 1979 millage, that situation where Lake Orion did not have a football team in 1979. What was your take on what happened there, and can you explain what happened?
Yes. We were cruising along. As I look here, we were 7-2. Had a bad year in 77, 3-6, and we were 5-4 in 78, and the millage in the spring went down, and they couldn't re-vote on it till October or November. Okay, so maybe they tried again in August, and it didn't go through. So the football program was canceled. And they, the administration and whatever, and the ball players knew that if you didn't play football for Doug Holcomb, you didn't play baseball. He was one of those guys, okay? Unless you were outstanding a baseball player and had a good reputation.
Right.
But what happened was one of his former catchers, and I don't know if he played football, was a kid by the name of, or a young man by the name of Kirk Erickson. And he had gone through the system, and Notre Dame prep was called Pontiac Catholic. Okay?
Oh, wow.
And he was the athletic director at Pontiac Catholic. And when they didn't have football at Lake Orion, he knew how much Doug loved football, okay, and wouldn't be the same without him, without coaching football. So he said, well, as long as Orion doesn't have a team, why don't you come down and coach Pontiac Catholic's team, okay? Well, he did, because he was crazy about coaching.
Right.
So anyhow, that didn't sit well with Dick Cast,
Right.
the principal at the time. And I forget, in the colleges or something, sometime in the near past, there was a guy that left for a while and then came back, and the people weren't, you know, if you're not a Spartan or whatever forever, then if you go and coach someplace else, then you're not a true Spartan. You can't have your job back.
Right.
Well, what happened in that situation was there wasn't a JV program. There wasn't a freshman program. And I do believe we were playing 7th and 8th grade football at East and West, which would be Walden
Scripps.
Yeah, Walden Scripps, right. And so, in essence, we lost 5 years of football experience, okay? So Doug came back, and it was in a period where the era began to change. I remember one year we couldn't have Christmas because you might offend a Hindu or whatever in school, you know. Not worried about the other 2,000 kids that were Christian or whatever, you know, that celebrated Christmas as a holiday. And that era began to come in. And so Holcomb's style, he had to adjust his style a little bit. And he was good at that. He was good at that. He knew what he could do and what he could get away with and what he couldn't get away with. But Dick Cass was not as big a supporter of Doug as he had been. It started to be the era of not what you've done for me in the past, but what can you do for me now? Yeah. And so he started out 1-8,
Ooh.
and of course that didn't
No.
set well. Toward the end, well, 3, and then he was 3-6. Okay, all right. There was some sort of friction there where all of a sudden Doug wasn't the football coach, okay?
Right.
Well, that broke his heart, okay? Took the spirit right out of him. He left Lake Orion not too long after that, became a salesman using his dad's name from the big time for what you'd now say was Nike or Reebok or whatever, but at the time I think it was Bike, and became a athletic equipment salesman to the college people, okay?
Wow.
And that didn't work out real well. And so in the interim, Marty Malton took over the team. And they ended up playing at the Silver Dome, but I'm not sure, I'm 73 years old, okay? I'm not sure that we had playoffs at that time, okay? Where if you won 60 games, you were in. And then the Doug Frazier came in.
84 to 86.
Yeah, yeah. And he was fairly successful, 7-2, 8-1, and 5-4, and then left to be at the Seahome, football coach at Birmingham Seahome, and eventually became the athletic director and carried on the old tradition. The old blood, Baker and Malaton, myself, Dutcher had left long ago. I forget who the JV coaches were. Denny Davis.
Oh, that's a name that rings a bell.
Yeah, who recently passed away.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
Yes.
What a shock that was.
I know.
But Denny was one of those guys that I said, well, if you go to the doctor, they're going to tell you there's something wrong. He was really good. And he also coached a little bit at Waterford Our Lady of the Lakes.
Yep.
And
We love there.
his philosophy was for track was, you see that line? And somebody would say yes, and he says, well, when you hear a gunshot, take off and get back here as fast as you can. And he was really successful in volleyball. Okay?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. I've worked with him in volleyball.
I asked him one year, I think I had a bad year in baseball, and I asked him, I said, hey, Denny, what's your philosophy? How do you keep these kids winning all the time in volleyball? He says, simple. You just tell them don't let the ball hit the floor.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, we're going to end the first episode of History Now. We're going to go right in the second episode of History Now.
Okay.
All right, fans, we're going to head on out. Lake Orion, have a great night from History Now here on ONTV. Be back for episode 2.